I remember that night clearly. It was the kind of night where nothing felt quite right, and I couldn't figure out exactly why. The fan hummed softly in the background, trying to circulate the air in our small apartment. But it wasn't enough. The room felt stifling, and every creak of the walls seemed to echo in the silence. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, trying to will myself to sleep, but my mind wouldn't shut off. Jake, my straight roommate, was asleep in his bed across the room, or at least I thought he was. The soft sound of his breathing should have been comforting. Just another part of the routine we'd built over the past 6 months of living together. But lately, things had started to feel different, complicated even, and I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was happening between us was about to reach a tipping point. To anyone else, we were just two regular guys sharing an apartment. Nothing unusual. We split rent, shared groceries, and hung out when we had time. Typical stuff. Jake was a good roommate, too. He kept to himself when he needed to, but we bonded over beers, late-night TV, and a shared love for dumb action movies. There wasn't much we didn't talk about, but recently, there was one thing we'd both been avoiding, pretending like it wasn't there. It was hard to pinpoint when it had started, but over the last few weeks, I'd found myself thinking about Jake more than I should. Not just the casual thoughts you'd have about your friend. No, this was something different. Something that made my heart beat a little faster whenever he was around. Something that made me hyper-aware of the way he'd brush against me when we passed each other in the narrow hallway. It was a tension that simmered beneath the surface. Something unspoken but undeniably present. I shifted under the covers, trying to ignore the heat that crept up my neck as I thought about him. Jake was the kind of guy who made everything seem effortless. He was confident without being cocky, funny in a way that never felt forced, and somehow always knew the right thing to say. And it didn't help that he was good-looking, tall, broad-shouldered with a jawline that could cut glass. The kind of guy who probably had women falling at his feet without even trying. But that wasn't the part that had been keeping me up at night. No! What I couldn't stop thinking about was the way Jake had started looking at me. It wasn't obvious, not something anyone else would pick up on, but I could feel it. It was in the way his gaze would linger a little too long when we were talking, the way his jokes had become a little more personal, a little more teasing. And then there were the nights like this one, when we'd sit in silence, each of us in our own beds, and I could feel his presence across the room, heavy and palpable, like a weight pressing down on my chest. I rolled over, facing the wall, trying to push the thoughts away. I wasn't into guys. I'd always been straight, always dated women. So why was I lying here thinking about my roommate like this? Why did my heart race whenever he got too close, whenever his arm brushed against mine? It didn't make any sense. But just as I was starting to convince myself that it was all in my head, I heard the soft rustle of sheets, followed by the sound of footsteps. My heart jumped into my throat as I froze, listening to Jake's movements. Was he getting up to use the bathroom? Grabbing a glass of water? I didn't dare turn around to check. Can't sleep? His voice was quiet, almost hesitant, but it sent a jolt of electricity through me. I swallowed hard, still facing the wall, unsure how to respond. My mouth felt dry, my mind racing as I tried to process what was happening. Was this normal? Was it weird that he was standing there, talking to me in the middle of the night? No, not really. I finally managed, my voice barely above a whisper. There was a pause, a long, heavy silence that hung in the air between us. I could feel him watching me, his gaze burning into my back, and I forced myself to stay still, to keep my breathing steady. Maybe if I pretended to be half asleep, this strange moment would pass, and things would go back to normal in the morning. But he didn't move. He didn't walk away or head back to his bed. Instead, I heard the sound of his footsteps again, and then before I knew it, he was sitting on the edge of my bed. My pulse quickened, and I could feel the tension building, thickening the air around us. This wasn't normal. This wasn't just two guys sharing a space. There was something else here, something I didn't understand but couldn't ignore. I turned my head slightly, just enough to catch a glimpse of him out of the corner of my eye. He was sitting close, too close, his posture relaxed, but his eyes were locked on me, intense and unreadable. My heart pounded in my chest, and I forced myself to stay calm to not let him see how much he was affecting me. "You've been acting kind of weird lately," Jake said, his voice low, almost casual, but there was an edge to it, like he was testing the waters. "Everything okay?" I swallowed hard, unsure how to respond. How could I explain the thoughts running through my head, the confusion that had been building for weeks? I couldn't just come out and say it, that I'd been thinking about him in ways that I didn't understand, that I didn't know how to stop. So I did what I always did when things got too complicated. "Yeah, I'm fine," I lied, forcing a smile that I hoped looked convincing. "Just work's been a lot, I guess." Jake didn't look convinced. His eyes stayed on me, searching like he was trying to figure out what I wasn't saying. For a moment, I thought he was going to push further, but then he just nodded, leaning back slightly. "Yeah, I get that," he said, his voice softer now. "Work's been kicking my ass too." Another silence fell between us, but this one felt different. He wasn't saying anything, but I could feel the weight of his presence, the tension that seemed to buzz in the air. I glanced over at him again, and this time he was staring straight at me, his gaze locked on mine in a way that made my pulse quicken. "Look," Jake said suddenly, his voice cutting through the silence. "I'm just going to say it, all right? I've been getting this vibe from you lately. Like, something's different. Between us." My heart skipped a beat. There it was, the thing we hadn't been talking about. I opened my mouth to deny it, to brush it off as nothing, but the words wouldn't come. Because he was right. Something had changed. Jake leaned in closer, his hand brushing against mine in a way that sent a shiver down my spine. "You feel it too, don't you?" he whispered, his voice low and rough. I didn't know how to respond. My mind was screaming that this was wrong, that I needed to say something, anything to stop whatever was happening. But my body wasn't listening. "I don't know what this is," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "But yeah, I feel it." Jake's eyes darkened, and for a moment I thought he was going to pull away, to end this before it could go any further. But instead, he stayed where he was, and I could feel the tension between us building, thickening the air around us. Jake didn't pull away. Instead, he stayed exactly where he was, his presence filling the small space between us. I could feel my pulse racing, my skin tingling from the electricity in the air. "You know," Jake said quietly, his voice low and rough, "I've been thinking about this for a while now." My breath caught in my throat. The words hung in the air heavy with meaning, and I wasn't sure what to say. I hadn't expected him to be so blunt. Hadn't thought he'd just come out and say what we'd both been avoiding for weeks. But now, with the words out in the open, there was no denying it. Whatever was happening between us, it wasn't just in my head. Jake felt it too. I wasn't sure how to handle this. Wasn't sure what I was supposed to do or say. My entire life, I'd been sure of one thing. I was straight. There had never been any question about it. I'd had girlfriends, done all the things a guy like me was supposed to do. But now, sitting here with Jake, everything felt upside down, like the ground had shifted beneath my feet. Jake watched me closely, his eyes dark and intense, and I could feel the weight of his gaze pressing down on me, making it harder to breathe. I wanted to say something, anything, to break the tension that was building between us, but I couldn't. My throat felt dry, my mind a mess of conflicting emotions. He shifted slightly, leaning closer until our knees were almost touching, and my heart raced in response. "I don't know what this is," he continued, his voice barely above a whisper, "but I can't stop thinking about it, about you." His words sent a jolt through me. He was being so open, so honest, and I wasn't sure I was ready for that. But at the same time, I couldn't deny the way my body was reacting to him, the way my pulse quickened whenever he was near. I didn't want to admit it, didn't want to face what was happening, but there was no escaping it now. I started, my voice shaky, unsure where I was going with this. "I've never, thought about guys like that." Jake's lips quirked up in a small smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. Neither did I, he admitted, his voice rough with emotion. But this, whatever this is, it's real. You feel it too, right? I couldn't lie, not now. I nodded slowly, my eyes meeting his, and I could see the relief wash over his face. It was like he'd been holding his breath, waiting for me to say something, to confirm that he wasn't alone in this. But now that I had, the air between us felt even more charged, the tension thickening until it was almost unbearable. He moved a little closer, his knee brushing against mine, and I swallowed hard, trying to steady my breathing. I don't know what to do, I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. This is all, it's weird, right? Jake chuckled softly, but there was a seriousness in his eyes that hadn't been there before. Yeah, it's weird, he agreed, but it doesn't have to be bad. It doesn't have to be scary. But it was scary. It was terrifying. Everything about this felt like walking a tightrope, like one wrong move could send me crashing down into a place I wasn't ready to go. But at the same time, I couldn't deny the pull I felt toward him, the way my body seemed to react on its own whenever he was near. It was like gravity drawing me in even though I knew I should resist. For a moment, we just sat there, the silence between us thick with unspoken words. I could feel his eyes on me, feel the tension in the air growing with every passing second. And then, without warning, Jake leaned in, closing the small distance between us. My breath caught in my throat as his face came closer to mine, and for a split second, I thought about pulling away, about stopping this before it could go any further. But before I could make a decision, his lips brushed against mine, soft and tentative, like he was testing the waters. The kiss was brief, barely a whisper of a touch, but it was enough to send my heart racing, my pulse pounding in my ears. I sat there, frozen, unsure of what to do, unsure of what this meant. And then Jake pulled back, just enough to look me in the eyes, his expression unreadable. I shouldn't have done that, he said quietly, his voice filled with regret. But instead of feeling relief, I felt a strange sense of disappointment wash over me. I didn't know why, I couldn't explain it, but there was a part of me that didn't want him to pull away. There was a part of me that wanted more. No, I said quickly, surprising even myself. It's okay. Jake's eyes widened slightly, like he hadn't expected that response. And for a moment we just stared at each other, the air between us thick with tension. And then, before I could second-guess myself, I leaned forward, closing the gap between us once again. This time, when our lips met, it wasn't tentative or hesitant. It was full of emotion, full of the tension that had been building between us for weeks. My heart pounded in my chest as I kissed him, my mind spinning with confusion and desire. This wasn't supposed to happen. This wasn't who I was. But in that moment, none of it mattered. Jake's hand slid up to the back of my neck, pulling me closer, deepening the kiss, and I found myself responding in ways I hadn't expected. My body moved on its own, pressing closer to him, and I could feel the heat radiating off his skin, the warmth of his breath against my lips. Everything about this felt intense, overwhelming, and I couldn't get enough. But just as quickly as it had started, it ended. Jake pulled back, his breath coming in short, shallow gasps, and I could see the conflict in his eyes. He was just as confused as I was, just as unsure of what was happening between us. I started, but the words wouldn't come. I didn't know what to say, didn't know how to explain what I was feeling. All I knew was that something had changed between us, something that couldn't be undone. Jake ran a hand through his hair, looking away for a moment before turning back to me. We don't have to figure this out right now, he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. But we can't ignore it either. I nodded, my heart still racing, my mind spinning. He was right. Whatever this was, it wasn't something we could just pretend didn't exist. But at the same time, I didn't know how to deal with it. I didn't know what came next. We'll figure it out, Jake said as if reading my mind. Together, I wanted to believe him. I wanted to think that somehow we could make this work, that we could figure out what was happening between us without everything falling apart. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. Nothing about this was simple. Jake stood up, offering me a small, tentative smile. Let's just take it one step at a time, all right? I nodded, my throat tight with emotion. Yeah, one step at a time. But even as I said the words, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was the beginning of something bigger, something I wasn't sure I was ready for. And as Jake walked back to his bed, the room suddenly felt too small, too claustrophobic. I lay back down, staring at the ceiling once again. But this time, sleep didn't come. My mind was too full of everything that had just happened, and I knew that nothing would ever be the same again. Things didn't go back to normal after that night. In fact, nothing about the way I felt was normal anymore. Every moment I spent with Jake felt charged, like the air between us was constantly buzzing with something unspoken. We tried to act like things hadn't changed, like we were still just roommates, but deep down, I knew we were past that now. We had crossed a line, and there was no going back. A few days had passed since the kiss. Jake and I hadn't talked about it, hadn't acknowledged it, but the memory of it lingered between us like a ghost. It was all I could think about, how his lips had felt against mine, how my heart had raced when we'd kissed, how everything about that moment had felt both wrong and right at the same time. But we both knew it wasn't over. The tension was still there, simmering beneath the surface, waiting to erupt again. It happened one night after we'd spent the evening watching a movie. We'd both had a few beers, and the alcohol had loosened the tight grip I'd been holding on my emotions. The movie had ended, and we sat in the quiet living room, the flickering light of the TV casting shadows on the walls. Jake was sitting with me, and there was something different in his gaze, something darker, more intense, and I could feel my pulse quicken under his scrutiny. My stomach twisted in knots as I tried to ignore the way he was looking at me, but it was impossible. Still thinking about the other night, Jake said. Yeah, I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. I've been thinking about it. Me too, he said quietly. It's hard not to, you know, with everything that's been building between us. My heart pounded in my chest as I nodded, unable to find the words to respond. Everything felt so heavy, so intense, like we were both standing on the edge of something dangerous. And I knew, without a doubt, that if I let myself fall, there would be no going back. His words sent a shiver down my spine, and I found myself leaning in too, like I was being pulled toward him by an invisible force. The space between us seemed to shrink, the air growing thick with tension. I could feel my pulse racing, my heart hammering in my chest as my mind screamed at me to stop this before it went any further. Jake's hand reached out, his fingers brushing against my arm, and I felt a spark of electricity shoot through me at the contact. My breath hitched in my throat as I looked at him, my mind spinning with confusion and desire. This was wrong. I knew it was wrong, but the way he was looking at me, the way his touch sent shivers down my spine, I couldn't walk away from it. Not now. I wanted to, I whispered, the words slipping out before I could stop them. Jake's eyes darkened, and before I knew what was happening, he was closing the distance between us, his hand sliding up my arm to the back of my neck. He pulled me toward him, his lips crashing against mine with a force that left me breathless. This kiss was different from the last one. It was hungrier, more desperate, like all the tension that had been building between us was finally spilling over. I didn't hesitate this time. I kissed him back, my hands gripping his shirt as I pulled him closer. And then it began. It was just us, just this moment. Everything about this felt intense, overwhelming, like I was being consumed by the fire that burned between us. We moved together, our bodies pressing closer, hands grasping, pulling, desperate for more. The couch felt too small, too confined, and before I knew it we were stumbling to our feet, barely breaking the kiss as we made our way to my bedroom. The world was a blur, the air around us thick with heat and tension as we tumbled onto the bed. Our clothes disappeared somewhere in the haze, and soon it was just us. When it was over, we lay there in silence, our bodies tangled together, our breaths heavy and uneven. The weight of what we had just done pressed down on me, but I couldn't bring myself to regret it. Not yet. Not while the warmth of his body was still pressed against mine, while the memory of his touch still lingered on my skin. The morning after felt like the world had shifted. The sun streamed through the blinds, casting patterns of light and shadow across the bed, but everything else seemed still. Too still. Jake was next to me, his arm loosely draped over my waist, his face calm, peaceful even as he slept. But my mind was anything but calm. I stared up at the ceiling, trying to piece together the events of last night. It didn't feel real. Part of me wanted to believe it had all been a dream, but the warmth of Jake's body beside me and the lingering sensation of his touch made it impossible to pretend otherwise. What had I done? This wasn't supposed to happen. I wasn't supposed to feel this way about him. I wasn't supposed to be here, lying in bed with my roommate after a night like that. But no matter how hard I tried to rationalize it, to tell myself it was just a mistake, a one-time thing, I knew it wasn't that simple. I carefully shifted, trying not to wake him as I slid out from under his arm and sat up. The cool air hit my skin, sending a shiver through me. But it wasn't just the temperature that made me feel cold. It was the weight of everything that had happened, the weight of what this meant for both of us. I pulled on a pair of sweats and quietly slipped out of the room, closing the door softly behind me. My legs felt shaky as I made my way to the kitchen, the early morning light casting a strange glow on everything. It was too quiet. The hum of the fridge, the distant sound of traffic outside, the occasional creak of the floorboards beneath my feet. It all felt too loud in the silence that had settled over my thoughts. I leaned against the counter, running a hand through my hair as I tried to make sense of it all. What was I supposed to do now? How was I supposed to face Jake after this? Last night had changed everything. There was no pretending it hadn't happened, no going back to the way things were. But where did that leave us? A sound from behind me made me jump, and I turned to see Jake standing in the doorway, his hair a mess, his expression unreadable. For a moment, neither of us said anything. The silence stretched between us, thick with unspoken words, and I felt my stomach twist in knots. "Hey," Jake said softly, his voice still rough from sleep. "You okay?" I nodded, but the truth was, I wasn't sure if I was okay. I wasn't sure how to answer that question. "Yeah," I replied, though my voice sounded hollow, even to my own ears. Jake took a step forward, hesitating as if he wasn't sure what to say either. The tension between us was palpable, a weight neither of us knew how to handle. "Last night," he began, but his voice trailed off, and I could see the same confusion mirrored in his eyes. I swallowed hard, my heart pounding in my chest. "Yeah," I said quietly. "Last night." We both stood there, awkward and uncertain, neither of us willing to fully address what had happened. It was like we were both waiting for the other to say something, to make sense of it all, but neither of us had the answers. Finally, Jake took a deep breath and stepped closer. "Look," he said, his voice soft but steady. "I don't regret it. I need you to know that." His words caught me off guard, and I looked up at him, surprised by the sincerity in his voice. He didn't regret it, but how could that be? Everything about last night had been impulsive, driven by a tension we didn't understand. How could he not feel the same confusion, the same doubt that was eating away at me? "I don't know what to think," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "I don't even know what this is." Jake's expression softened, and he nodded as if he understood exactly what I was feeling. "I don't either," he said, "but I know what I feel. And last night felt right." I opened my mouth to argue, to tell him that it didn't feel right, that it couldn't feel right, but the words wouldn't come, because deep down, I knew he was telling the truth. Last night had felt right in a way I hadn't expected, in a way I couldn't explain. It had felt real, like something that had been simmering beneath the surface for longer than either of us had realized. Jake stepped closer again, and this time, I didn't back away. His presence was grounding, calming in a way I hadn't expected, and I found myself leaning into it, even though my mind was still a whirlwind of confusion. "We can figure this out," he said quietly, his eyes locked on mine. "We don't have to have all the answers right now." I wanted to believe him, wanted to trust that we could figure this out, that we could find a way to navigate whatever this was without everything falling apart. But the fear was still there, gnawing at the edges of my thoughts. "What if we can't?" I asked, my voice trembling. Jake's gaze softened and he reached out, gently brushing his fingers against my arm. "We can," he said with a quiet confidence that made my heart skip a beat. "We'll take it one step at a time." I nodded, though the fear still lingered. But in that moment, standing there with Jake, I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe we could figure this out. Maybe this didn't have to be the end of everything we'd built. Maybe it could be the beginning of something new. We spent the rest of the morning in quiet conversation, sitting at the kitchen table with coffee cups in hand, talking about everything and nothing at the same time. It was easy, comfortable in a way I hadn't expected, and for a brief moment it felt like we were just two friends hanging out like we always had. But beneath the surface, there was something more, something unspoken but understood. It wasn't until the afternoon that the reality of what we'd done began to sink in. We couldn't stay in this bubble forever. Eventually, we'd have to face the consequences of our actions, the questions that would inevitably arise. What would this mean for our friendship, for our living situation, for everything we thought we knew about ourselves? But for now, we didn't have to deal with that. For now, we could just exist in this moment, in the quiet stillness of the day, and figure things out as we went along. The days that followed were a mix of uncertainty and cautious hope. We didn't jump into anything, didn't rush to define what had happened between us. Instead, we let things unfold naturally, taking it one step at a time, just like Jake had said. And slowly, bit by bit, the fear that had gripped me began to loosen. There were still moments of doubt, still times when I questioned whether this was the right path for me, for us. But each time Jake was there, steady and calm, reminding me that we didn't have to have all the answers right away, that we could take our time. And in the quiet moments, when it was just the two of us, I started to realize that maybe this wasn't about labels or definitions. Maybe it was just about connection, about finding something real in the midst of all the confusion and chaos. Maybe it was about letting go of the things I thought I knew and embracing the possibility of something new. It became a quiet understanding, a shared experience that brought us closer together in ways I hadn't expected. As the weeks passed, we fell into a new routine. It wasn't perfect, and we still had our moments of doubt. But for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. As I sat there, feeling the weight of the silence pressing in on me, I realized that no matter how hard I tried to understand it all, some truths didn't need to be spoken just yet. Because no matter what happened next, we had already reached a point of no return. And perhaps, just perhaps, that was how it was meant to be.